So today we're going to be talking about Vagrant, which is basically a tool to help bring some of the automation that's become very popular in production environments down to the development environment. So in our case, it's basically a way to automate the creation of a virtual machine that is then provisioned using all the puppet work that Mark has done over the past couple of years. And what that gets you is a development environment that very closely mirrors our production environments at Rackspace and also is very easy to tear down, rebuild, keep separate from your main host operating system so that if you need to upgrade your laptop to the latest release of OS 10 or Windows, there's no risk of it breaking your development environment. So it makes things a lot simpler in that way. So to kind of walk through the issues like why you want Vagrant around and what it replaces, I want to look at a couple of things first. The first example here is from a very popular Zen Framework developer, guy who wrote Zen Framework in Action. Uh, when the new OS 10 came out, he released this guide on his blog the other day explaining how to get the lamp stack up and running on OS 10 Mavericks. And as you can see, it's a whole lot of steps. It's for each tool that he wants to use, he's kind of got a step-by-step guide for what you need to do to get your environment working again. And this is a pretty extensive thing for every person on the staff to figure out. And this is only for the people using a Mac. And then, someone hopping onto Windows 8 is going to have a very different set of steps they have to take. Someone using Ubuntu or Fedora is going to have a completely different set of steps to take. So it gets pretty messy. And it pretty much already is messy. Like if we look at the 4 Mac users we have on Delta's staff, myself, Darby, Kaylee, and Nick, we have 4 different development environments going on. In my case, I'm using a PHP build from a company called LIIP. Darby is using Zen Server, Kaylee is using MAMP, and I don't think Nick has a local environment. He's just pushing things to the staging server as he's working on them. So that's 4 very different environments, all of which might introduce bugs. So as I was working with Kaylee recently on getting her ramped into Zen Framework projects, we started spotting issues with her MAMP-based environment that were going to prevent her from doing Zen Framework projects. And I ended up making a little project that basically tests a development environment to see, does this match our requirements for doing our larger projects? So for example, it's going to check to see, do you have the iMagick pickle extension installed? Do you have the INTL pickle extension installed? These things are very critical to a lot of our projects. But you wouldn't really notice that they were missing until you hit a very odd and difficult to track down bug. So, inspired in part by that, I started looking into Vagrant as a way of automating the creation of these development environments and making them a lot more consistent. So,
Brad,
yeah,
is that list for Mac only or for Windows as well?
this would be for anybody.
Okay.
One of the requirements, though, of a development environment, as you can see, is not being Windows. Because we do not really support developers working on Windows directly. And of course, you can have an editor running on Windows, but you can't actually execute PHP code on Windows or try to run Postgres on Windows or anything like that. That's just too big of a headache. So that is one of our requirements, is that your code not run in Windows. So Vagrant would be an option for those people who do use Windows day to day. So let's take a look at how it actually works. First, I'm just going to kind of go through the basics of using Vagrant, and then we'll get into the actual code. So I've basically here checked out the Vagrant branch of Delta's Puppet project in Git. I'll send around the URLs for all of these things as we wrap up. Once I'm in this folder, I can check the status of my Vagrant VM. So I'm just going to run Vagrant status, and it's telling me that my virtual machine running on VirtualBox is up and running right now. Because it's up and running, I can hop into that virtual machine to access it directly by running Vagrant SSH. Doesn't require that I have a password. It's going to do key-based authentication behind the scenes for me. So that's all ready to go. And once I'm on the machine, very similarly, I can use sudo to run a command as root without having to use a password inside this VM. So I get the ability to basically manage a Linux box, in this case CentOS, because that's what we use in production, without needing to use passwords at all. And very easily I can hop in and access it by running Vagrant SSH. In addition to that, Vagrant is going to set up a couple of shared folders. So in our Vagrant configuration, there's a Delta folder that goes in the root of your file system. So in Windows, /Delta, and Unix, just /Delta. And you can see, let's make a file here, that if I hop out of the virtual environment and go back to my local machine, so we can see here, now I'm on Brad's Mac. If I look in the Delta folder, that same thing that I just created inside the VM is present on my Mac as well. So it's sharing those files between the two for me. So if I'm editing code, I just use whatever editor I'm already using. I can use Vim, PHP Storm, Eclipse, whatever. But as soon as I save, that change is mirrored into the virtual machine for me. In addition to that, if we look inside the virtual machine, we'll see that it's listening on port 80. So this is Apache running here. And Vagrant is going to, behind the scenes, mirror port 80 inside the virtual machine to port 8080 on my Mac. So if I go into my browser and pull up my checkout of the district site, go to district.local:8080. This is the site running in the VM, so MySQL is installed inside the VM, but I'm accessing it just with my normal browser, and I didn't have to do any special networking setup or anything like that for that to work.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah,
How's that port chosen? Is that configurable?
it's configurable, but we're going to have a standard one at Delta based on our configuration,
Mhm.
which, so if that's a conflict, then we can pick a different one. But right now, 8080 is the standard. So if we look at our Vagrant configuration, we'll start to see how all of this is working. The first thing is that we tell it where to find the base virtual machine image. In this case, we're using another project's CentOS image. And basically, when you try to boot the Vagrant VM the first time, if it sees that you haven't set it up before, it'll download that image for you automatically. The next step here we can see is the actual port forwarding. So I'm saying on the guest, which is another way of saying the VM, I want port 80 to be mirrored as port 8080 on the host. And then here we can see the actual synced folders that I've set up. So /delta should be on both machines. And then some Puppet manifests, which we'll get to in a minute, should be mirrored into the VM as well so that we can use those. And then this is where kind of a lot of the mirroring of our production environment comes in, where we're doing these provisioning steps. So this first step, this is actually going to install Puppet into the VM the first time you run these scripts. This step here is going to actually apply a lot of the Puppet work that Mark has done to the VM to say, I want you to install Apache, install PHP, use these certain configuration files, get Postgres up and running with the correct caches, and so on. So a lot of configuration going on. And then finally, this last step here, just make sure that Apache is restarted the first time you boot up the VM, because we want to make sure that we spot whatever is in that Delta folder. So this configuration basically says this is how Vagrant should configure the virtual machine. And then it's these scripts and these Puppet manifests that define all of the things that should be placed into that VM to really get it ready to go. So we can see, for example, we've got many different packages from our production configurations. We've got MySQL put in place with a standard root password for MySQL inside these dev machines. We've got Postgres with several configuration changes made for the caches and various performance issues that we've encountered on production. And then we're going to say where Apache should find virtual host and so on. So we put a lot of things in place when we're first booting up the machine. So how do you actually get this running on your local machine? It's pretty much the same regardless of your operating system. You need to install VirtualBox, which you can find at virtualbox.org. It's now run by Oracle. It used to be a Sun project, but then Oracle bought Sun a few years back, just like with MySQL. Then you would have to install Vagrant itself, which you can find at vagrantup.com. And then you're going to check out that Git branch from our Delta Puppet project. And then the only thing you have to do at that point is run Vagrant up. And you run that inside the Git checkout that you just made. And when you do that, it's going to run these provisioning scripts, run all of these Puppet manifests, and so on. So the first boot that you do will take 15 to 20 minutes. Once that's done, you can control the VM in several different ways. So you can suspend it, which is basically going to take a snapshot of its memory and allow you to bring it back in the exact state that it was before. So you would just run Vagrant up again to bring it back up. You can halt it, which is actually requesting it to do a full shutdown. In that case, it won't be going back to the exact state it was in before you halted it. It's just like a normal shutdown of your PC, so it's going to do a full boot at the end, or when you run Vagrant up again. And you can also do Vagrant destroy, which is going to actually delete the VM from your hard drive completely, in which case, to get it back, again, you just run Vagrant up, but it's going to take 15 to 20 minutes to rebuild it all. That can be nice if for some reason you've got your VM into like a non-working state. You can just run Vagrant destroy and Vagrant up, and that'll rebuild it. So it's nice and easy to get the VM running. Once it's running, currently, we've got it to the point that it passes 21 out of 22 of our dev environment checklist items. The only one it's not finishing is installing Grunt, which is a tool we haven't really covered yet, so that's not a major deal. We need to get a couple Puppet things added for Grunt to be installed by default. So once it's up and running, you basically have this Delta folder where you can place your projects. So in this case, I've got the dev checklist and a district checkout in my Delta folder, and you'll notice I've got this vhost.d folder. This is the configuration for your virtual host. So let's take a look at one of these. So I'll bring up my district virtual host. You'll see that it's pretty heavily commented. That's coming from a template that Vagrant is going to put in place for you automatically. So you can just kind of open that and see what you need to do to change it. The main things you're going to change for every virtual host are the path that you're hosting. So in this case, it's the src folder inside a WordPress project. The actual host name that you're using. So this will typically be, something related to the project.local. The application environment, which is really only needed for a Zen framework project and should pretty much always be development unless you know otherwise. And then this path here would also be changed to be equal to your document root that you defined on line 10. So that's basically in a virtual host, you're going to be defining this path and this host name. That's pretty much what's going to change from each file. Of course, once you've defined this host name, district.local, you need to let your computer know what IP address that ties to. you do that in your host file. On a Mac, that's Etsy host. Oops. So if I open that file, you'll see that basically, I've got a whole lot of host entries all tied back to 127.0.0.1, so the local machine. So that just tells my computer, when I type district.local, that means I'm actually communicating with my computer. In Windows, you have a very similar file, follows the same format. It's going to be in c:\windows/etsy/host. So it's very similar, but it starts in the Windows folder rather than at the root level of your file system. So that gets you up and running with the full LAMP stack you need to run Delta projects. And beyond that, it's very similar to what you're probably already doing, either on your local machine or on one of our Rackspace servers. It's just, if I need to do something on the machine, like mess with MySQL, I have Vagrant SSH to go inside the VM. And then I've just got my full MySQL install. Same with Postgres. So if I need to get into Postgres, there we go. You can see the databases that are installed. So that's basically it. Over the coming week or so, I'm going to try to work with each person individually if they have issues getting this set up, but I would like everyone to try it. So again, the main things you're going to have to do: install VirtualBox, install Vagrant, and then do a checkout of this project from Git, which I'll put the URL in Basecamp for you, and then run Vagrant up, and that should give you this VM. So rather than trying to set all of this up on your own, this is kind of the preferred way to do it now. As we add more tools into our workflow and introduce new employees, this will make it a lot easier to keep everyone on the same page versus what we're doing now, which is basically everyone doing this ad hoc. So I think that's about it. Any questions? Okay, so I'll take that to mean that everyone understands this and will be setting this up over the next couple days. So if you have any issues while you're getting it set up, send me an email or Skype me, and I will help you fix them. Should work on Windows, Linux, or Mac. So this should be something that everyone can kind of follow the same instructions and then have a development environment that is pretty much identical to everyone else's. So I think that's all. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.